Hey there, welcome to Synth Seeker. My name's Luke. We're doing mobile mics tonight, laptop mic and the phone mic, because I'm going to be wandering around the studio. I had a couple different people now, 4 or 5, half a dozen, have been asking me how to use the external instrument plugin in Ableton to hook up multiple synths to Ableton using multiple MIDI ports and channels. And they just want to walk through. They're experiencing issues and they're trying to work through it. And I've got a system that seems to be working, so I'm just going to exhaustively walk through this. Show you how everything is routed in Ableton, show every wire that's running across the floor, making a terrible mess. I'm going to show you some serious cable rat's nests. And then I'm going to get into the routing within my audio interface. I'm going to pull up the routing table and things like that and show you how that works. Now, I use a MOTU audio interface. I use several of them all sort of connected. And so this is going to be, the Ableton stuff will be generically useful for people who are hooking up MIDI interfaces and audio interfaces into Ableton with multiple hardware synths. And then if you are a MOTU person who's got any of the MOTU AVB gear, I'm going to go through the routing table stuff, which is really poorly documented online. So I've only seen a couple videos that clearly show how to use the routing table and how to use the mixer. And so I'm going to try and cover that, at least how I use it. It may not be perfect for what you're doing, but, you know, we'll cross that bridge. So let's start with the diagram. Now, there are some assumptions. I make some assumptions on how I like to use my hardware, all right? So I'm going to walk you through this chart. If you're still watching, I'm already impressed, okay? Most people will have hung up in the first minute. So I've got a computer here. That's the blue box. Inside it is Ableton, is my DAW running, okay? And that's got some soft synth in it. And you don't have to worry too much about the soft synths, okay? But the way I run my studio is I use my computer and its DAW. I have a bunch of external synths. I use a push-to control surface as my main sort of playing and note entry system. I've also got a piano-style keyboard that I use as well, okay? But we start with the computer, all right? The computer and the push-to are hooked up to each other via USB. Pretty straightforward, okay? Then I've got hooked up via USB a MOTU MIDI Express. Then let me turn on the old. Okay, so the computer here is running down here. If I can get all crouchified. This is a MOTU MIDI Express 128. Okay, it's a relatively inexpensive MIDI interface. Okay, the whole point of this thing is to connect to the computer via USB, and it has 8 in ports and 8 out ports. Okay, now from the MIDI perspective, each port has 16 channels. So what that means is 8 times 16 is how many individual single channel synths I can use. Now, if you're using an MPE synth, it's going to want an entire port to itself, most likely. All right, or if you're polychaining, you may end up using several different channels. Actually, polychain, I think, still only uses one channel, but this is an external interface and it's connected to the computer via USB. In the back of this thing are 8 DIN ports that go out and 8 DIN ports that come in. All right, now we'll come back to that in a second. Now let's look at the diagram again, okay? So the computer has, via USB, this MIDI Express connected to it, all right? Now don't think too much on these arrows coming in. We'll talk about those later. But out the back of this thing, there's a bunch of different ports, and I'm running MIDI ports, say 1, 2, and 3. Okay, it's me specifically is a little bit different, but it's basically using some ports. Those cables are running through my house, through the studio, and going to little MIDI splitters, okay? I don't use any MPE devices, and I don't polychain anything. So I basically got one channel on each port controls one synth, all right? That's how I run my system, all right? So The cables that run out of this MIDI Express run through the studio in various places to MIDI splitters, okay? And those MIDI splitters then have DIN cables that run. This is all DIN. I don't use USB MIDI, okay? This will still work with USB MIDI, but you run into a different set of problems that I sidestep by not using USB. But these splitters split that single DIN from whatever port out into channels, okay? And each one of these cables from the splitter goes to a specific synth. And so any given synth is listening on one channel. So let me show you in hard, let's go trace some cables here, okay? This is where we were. So the back of this has got a cable running out of it. The cable runs along the wall, pardon the rat's nest. Down to this, I got a rack of synths here. And what's down on the floor there is a little MIDI Solutions Quadra Thru. It's a little 4-port splitter. There's a cable running into it from the right, and there's several cables running out of it from the left. The cable running in has port 1 channels 1 through 16 on it, okay? Every port has 16 channels. And then the 3 cables coming out of it are coming up to, for example, this ESQ1, all right? So there's a cable running out of that splitter into the in port of this Ensoniq, all right? This Ensoniq is listening on channel 2, right? So anything that I send from Ableton comes out port 1 on channel 2 is going to go to this Ensoniq and it'll play those notes, all right? As we keep going up, this synth here is listening on, what are we listening on? Let's see, what are we listening on? MIDI in channel. So this synth is listening on MIDI channel 1, all right? So that port 1 contains all 16 channels. It gets split into 3 cables. There are all 16 channels on each cable. One cable's going into here and it's ignoring everything but channel 2. Another cable's going into here and it's ignoring everything except what's on channel 1, all right? And then this Nord drum is channel 3. Okay, so that's how that's working. Now let's go back to the diagram. So if we follow this diagram, MIDI information comes out of Ableton through USB to the MIDI interface. For example, it says, okay, we'll send some notes out MIDI port 1, and it's going to come to this splitter, and the splitter is going to connect to some synths, okay? And they can be on whatever channels. Don't get too hung up on these numbers. But that'll go into those synths. Those synths are going to generate audio that's going to come out, the audio out ports on the back of the synth. I have various pedals and stuff that I'm going to run these synths through, okay? So those will plug into those pedals, just plain old instrument cable. Those pedals are going to then plug into, I have 3 audio interfaces, all right? So let's talk about those for a minute, all right? We'll go back to the camera. All right, for example, this little synth here, it's going to take MIDI information. It's going to come out, go into a splitter, get split between this synth and the one below it. This is listening on a particular channel. It's going to hear those notes. It's going to make its noise. That noise is going to come out the back, all right? Down through the instrument cable down to these pedals I got on the floor, all right? It's going to run through some pedals. Those are going to come around, pardon the rat's nest again, and I have 2 interfaces here, all right? They're little half-rack units. One is this MOTU 8A. This one is a MOTU Ultralight AVB, all right? But those cables are coming down. You can see that gold snake coming around. It's coming in the back here, all right? So that's coming into this interface. And we'll get to the routing table, but that's how every synth works. The MIDI comes out of the system to this MIDI interface. It leaves the back of the interface and gets split perhaps or routed to a particular synth, right? Synth. That synth's gonna hear those notes, play that sound. It's gonna come down. It may or may not go through some pedals. It's gonna come back and it's gonna end up coming back into this interface. And this is gonna send it to back to the computer, all right? Let's go back to the diagram. All right, now in my case, MIDI came out of the computer through the interface to the splitter to the synth. The synth generates audio that goes through pedals and then comes back into an interface, the audio coming in, all right? This audio gets back into the computer, in this case, through a Thunderbolt cable, but it could be USB or Firewire, or whatever your interface supports, okay? Also connected to this interface are my headphones, my monitors for things like that. All right, but we'll get back to how this audio works. This audio coming from the synths does not go to the monitors and the headphones, okay? And there's also a microphone input for me to talk into if I was feeling productive, but I'm not right now. So those synth audio comes through the pedals and into the interface, from the interface through the Thunderbolt port back into the DAW, okay? Now, I have multiple interfaces and they're all wired together using a network protocol called AVB, okay? Audio Video Bus. There's a switch involved. If you get, if you keep buying synths because, you should buy more synths, what will eventually happen is the back of this MOTU, well, let me show you. I'll show you the rat's nest. All right, so this has eight analog ins. Okay, they're back here. Well, if I use 2 of those for each synth, I can run 4 synths in here, okay? Well, I've got 5 synths right here. That's why I needed another one. And I expanded. Now, these 2 things will talk to each other through the AVB system. All right, I'll get into that in a minute. All right, but so when you run out of inputs, you have some options for getting additional inputs. What I do is I get another AVB interface and I wire them together. Okay, so this looks like, even though it's 2 interfaces, it looks like one to my computer, all right? And actually I ran out of space there as well, and I ended up, you can just keep on going. It's like Legos. So I got another one. This one has 24 analog inputs on it, right? And this is also connected via network cable to the other interfaces. So let's go back to the diagram. So in my case, I've got 1, 2, 3 interfaces. They all talk to each other via AVB, and they look like a single interface. And just one of them is connected to the computer via Thunderbolt. All right, that goes into Ableton. Ableton sees all this synth audio coming in. All right, I've manipulated. I'll get to how that's set up in Ableton in a minute. But then Ableton eventually mixes it down to a master bus, which comes back out through the Thunderbolt cable to this MOTU 8A, and instead of using its inputs for the synths, it uses an output to go to the monitors, to go to my headphones, all right? So that's how I get to hear what's going on. It all comes MIDI from Ableton, through the MIDI interface, gets split on out, comes to the synths, it might go through some pedals, back into some interfaces that are all networked together so they look like one interface, then back into Ableton, into the individual track inputs in Ableton. Ableton then mixes it all down to a stereo pair, which comes back out to this interface and runs out to my monitors or my headphones. All right. Now, let's talk about the routing here. How do these look like one interface, and how does Ableton see them? We're getting there. Let's go look at Ableton. Now, if I bring up Ableton's preferences, and I look at my input config, so Ableton thinks that there's 42 analog inputs coming into it from its single interface. Ableton says, oh, you've only got one interface, it's this 8A, right? But if you look at the hardware spec of the 8A, it's only got 8 inputs, so how can it generate 42? Well, all those other interfaces are networked together, and it looks like one big-ass interface, all right? Let's go look at that routing table. So if I go pull up, now I like MOTU gear, okay? At this point, we're getting very specific to the gear, okay? MOTU gears doesn't have much on the front panel, okay? It's not like having a mixer that's got a control surface, something you can lay your hands on. It's all digital. All right, so here's the device routing. Now, when you hook all these devices together with an Ethernet cable and an AVB switch, you can't just use any switch, you got to use one that supports AVB. MOTU sells one, and it's quite inexpensive, so I would buy theirs if I was going to get one. It's about a third the cost of getting one made by another company. Basically, you can see the config of all these devices. This is the 8A we're looking at. And so these are the actual 8 analog inputs of the 8A, all right? And then over here are things that are coming in as under AVB, okay? AVB, the way it connects machines together, interfaces together, is through the use of AVB streams. Okay, a stream is 8 channels that can go across Ethernet, and the interfaces support multiple streams. All right, so my 8A is the master. All right, its clock is internal. Everything else is following the 8A's clock. All right, so if I click over to the ultralight AVB, this is the AVB interface, and it has its inputs, its actual physical inputs, 6 inputs, 2 guitar, 2 mics, okay? We want to send these over an AVB stream over to my 8A. So we look at its routing table. This is the routing table for the ultralight. And we say its AVB configuration is that it has 1 output stream, okay? That means 8 channels can go across. It supports more than 1, but I'm just using 8 channels off of this thing. I don't need all 10. So I say 1 output stream. That gives me a listing in my outs of AVB stream 1, channels 1 through 8, and I assign the outputs to it on this matrix by turning them on. So I'm sending mic 1, guitar 1, and analog inputs 1 through 6 across this stream. That's what's coming out of it, all right? On the 24 AI, I'm doing the same thing, except I've got 3 streams. Each stream has 8 channels. And basically I'm just routing the 24 analog inputs to the 3 AVB streams, all right? If we go back to the 8A, its configuration says it's taking 4 AVB input streams. It's taking 1 from the ultralight and 3 from the 24 AI. And that basically puts an ass load of incoming streams up here in this list. And then I say, okay, computer, heads up, I'm going to send you 42 audio streams. I type in 42 here, and basically it populates this big-ass list. And then I just go through the matrix and I assign analog inputs coming across the streams, including the 8 that are built into the 8A, so that's these ones here. And the rest of these are the stream that came from the other devices going into the other inputs on the computer. All right? Now, I've also got, it's got an inbuilt mixer. Now I'm trying to keep it as simple as possible, so I want to feed from Ableton, a stereo feed. That's this one, feeds channel 1, 2 from the computer, and feeds channel 3, 4 from the computer. The reason I have 2 stereo feeds is one's for the mains of Ableton, which is this, and then there's one for the cue. So the metronome runs through the cue, and the regular audio runs through the master, okay, the mains. All right, and what that lets me do in this mixer is take the mains, okay, and I feed them to the mains, but I also feed them into group 1, and then take the metronome click coming in off of 3, 4. I don't feed that to the mains, so you guys don't hear it, it doesn't get captured, and it goes to group 1, 2. And then my monitor, my headphones, are listening to group 1 and 2, which is a mix of the metronome and the mains, and then the mains go out the mains. All right, so that's how I'm doing the mixing, and it allows me to cue things without you guys hearing it. This is useful when you're live streaming. Anyway, going back to the routing table. So this is 42 channels of audio. You basically say, here's the analog ins. I want it to go to analog to computer, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then I've got all these other 2 computer ones. That's going to send the mic and the guitar, and basically everything coming across the streams in there. All right. From the computer, I've got 4 streams, stream 1 and stream 2. Excuse me, not streams. I've got 4 channels. Channel 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2 are the mains from Ableton. 3, 4 is the monitor from Ableton. And those are going into the mixer. 1, 2, 3, 4 on those channels of the mixer, which is what we saw here. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. Now let's go back to Ableton. So we've got 42 channels of audio coming into Ableton. If we look at the inputs on Ableton, on our input config, here they are. 1, 2 is mic and guitar, which I'm not using right now. If I wanted to, I would turn these on, but I'm not going to right now. You can type in names here. I started to, but it's like, meh, that's not a big deal. And this audio is what's coming in. It's all enabled, all right? Now, depending on your audio interface and how it works, the more inputs you have enabled sometimes puts a little more load on your machine. At least for the MOTU stuff, it does not seem to do that, okay? And let me go back. Kill that. We'll go back here. Here's my input config. we'll close that down. All right, MIDI config, let's look at that for a second. So the MOTU MIDI Express looks like this. As far as my outputs are concerned, I've got all these ports, 1 through 8. And I say send track data, that's note and CCs. Send the sync data, that's the MIDI clock and transport. And then also send remotes. So if I want to send Ableton envelopes doing remote CCs, I need this turned on to go do that. All right. All right. And that's how it works. And basically, now I've got audio coming into Ableton. So how do I set up tracks for instruments? Okay. Well, you want to use the external instrument plugin. So here's my track. I've decided this is the Nord A1 track. Okay. So where is that coming from? Well, I drop an external instrument in here, and then I decide, okay, what MIDI do I want to send to it? And I say, okay, you're going to get MIDI that's coming out on port 6, and I want you to listen to channel 1, which means I got to walk over to that Nord, and I have to configure it to say, listen only to channel 1. So it doesn't play any notes that are intended for other synths that are on the same port. All right. So any MIDI that I play is going to go out to that synth and generate some sound. And then on the audio from, I pick what list from the list of all the inputs I've got, which one is going to get its stuff. And in this case, it's 1920. All right. That's what I'm going to use from, and set the gain, and away we go, off to the races. All right. I do that. I rinse and repeat that pattern for every synth I've got. All right. Each one is on its own track. Each one has its own external instrument that's going to its own port and channel. Basically, every synth has to have a unique combination of port and channel. All right. And then out the back of the interface, those plugs 1 through 8 are ports 1 through 8. And they each carry 16 channels. And you tell the synth which channel to listen to. And then pick which interface channels, audio channels that is, it will come back in on. In this case, 910. All right. Then you rinse and repeat. Don't worry about all these other plugins in here. Those are just effects that I've got set up in this template for me to use. Right? But in a nutshell, that's what you want to do. So just to recap this stuff. I've got my computer connected via USB to my push control. I've got it connected via USB to a MIDI Express interface that has 8 ports on it. Any MIDI that comes out is assigned a port and a channel, and then it comes out the back of that port. This is DIN cables to some splitters that run DIN cables to my synths. All right. The synths are all listening on their own channel and port. All right. Their audio might go through some pedals, and then it goes into my interfaces. If you have one interfaces or multiple interfaces, it doesn't matter. It's going to go into an interface uniquely. I happen to have multiple interfaces. They're all wired together so that they look like one big ass interface to the computer. That audio comes into Ableton. Ableton does its thing. I mix it, master it, play those notes, sequence it, do whatever, slice and dice. And then that audio comes back out of Ableton to my primary interface, the 8A, which will drive my headphones and my speakers. All right. Now, the only thing that I haven't talked about in this diagram is, well, Luke, I don't have a push 2. I've got a MIDI keyboard I'm going to use as a controller. Well, and it doesn't do USB. If it does USB, just plug it in like I plug in a push 2. If you've got like an M-Audio or whoever makes, a lightweight controller of some kind, just use USB, plug it in your computer, and tell Ableton, here's my input. It'll be fine. But if you've got a controller that only does DIN MIDI, okay, what you're going to do is plug that controller into the inputs on the MOTU MIDI Express. And then you tell Ableton, hey, listen to that input. It's really easy. It's that simple, okay? If you don't have a keyboard controller or a push 2, and you want to use one of your synths to be the controller, like a master keyboard, right? But that synth is busy making synth noises too, right? What you can do is check that synth's manual, okay, RTFM, and you're looking for a configuration called local control, and you want to turn it off. What it does is it detaches the keyboard from controlling the synth, and the keyboard will just send MIDI at that point, all right? And then you run the MIDI outs of that synth into your MOTU MIDI Express inputs, which will get it into Ableton, and you can treat it like it's a piano controller, but it doesn't generate any sound, okay? Now, to get that synth that you're using as a controller to make sound, you turn that local control off, and then when you play, the MIDI will go into Ableton, get routed back out through USB to the Express, make it through the splitter, and then come back to that synth, and it will play. All right, so that's fine. But what happens is any knobs you turn on that synth may or may not have any effect. Okay, it just depends on how that synth's MIDI implementation works. Okay, I find using a synthesizer with local control turned off very frustrating from a creative perspective. I much prefer to have a controller like a push-to or a piano-style USB or MIDI controller to use solely as my input device and let my synths just be synths, and if I play them, they play and they're happy. Okay. What I do is when I'm composing, I'm almost always on the push and the piano controller and never actually touching the synths. But when I do sound design, I stand at the synths and use their keyboards and knobs to design my sounds. And that's how that works. Generally saving it as a preset if they support presets. And if not, just hoping to be damn sure that I don't bump anything. Okay, really, that's about it. Okay, so that's the exhaustive explanation of how I use multiple synths in Ableton using the external control device, external instrument device. If you have any questions or comments, put them in the comments and I will try to answer them. But again, I'm limiting this. I use MOTU gear exclusively. If you use MOTU gear, specifically the AVB networking gear, great, I can try and help you. And if not, read the manual, okay? But the pattern is the same, okay? MIDI control goes into Ableton, out of Ableton to an interface. From that interface to possibly splitters. If you only have 2 or 3 synths, you're not going to need a splitter. You can just run it all. Into the synths, audio from the synths goes into any effects processing you have, then into the interfaces aggregate it all. It goes back into Ableton, gets processed, comes back out to my monitors and headphones, or gets recorded. All right. Whew. All right, now let's go try to edit this mess down, okay? I will talk to you later. I hope this was useful. This was super not a musical sort of video, but people were asking and I'm just trying to help. So I hope this was useful. As always, you've been listening to me ramble here on Synth Seeker. Have a good weekend.